Security Conference. Well, let's cross to Birmingham. Let's bring in Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. Good to see you. Good to talk to you, Professor. First of all, let's start with Avdiivka, the blame on the US that we've heard today. Is it as clear and simple as that to you? More money, more weapons to defend?
Well, the reality is that the Russians, after trying to take Avdiivka throughout the 2 years of this invasion, and then especially since last October, finally succeeded by leveling the city in large part with artillery shelling. And they have a 10-to-1 advantage over Ukraine in those artillery shells. Now, part of the issue for Ukraine is Europe trying to ramp up production for artillery shells. Europe will only deliver about 50% of what it promised by March. But part of it is that this very small but loud group of Trumpist and hard-right Republicans, of whom J.D. Vance is one, are effectively blackmailing Ukraine by holding up this $60 billion in economic, financial, and military aid. Had they worked with others in Congress to get this aid package back through in October, Ukraine would have had more shells on the front line. Doesn't necessarily mean that they would have held on to Avdiivka. The Russians effectively used human wave assaults and took tens of thousands of casualties to finally overrun the town. But it does mean that, yes, the balance on the battlefield would have been significantly different if the U.S. had been involved in providing assistance to Ukraine, and the situation on the battlefield will be different if the Trumpists continue to blackmail and withhold American aid.
That's a really good point, actually, Scott. Can we just dig a little deeper into it? I mean, many military analysts on that side of the country in the East talk about this as a war of ammunition, drones and shells for months, in which many would say that Ukraine have actually been smarter, they've been more cunning, they've been more effective. But when you talk about the figures you just did, 10 shells to 1, and the manner in which Russia have been prepared to, well, the Kremlin has been prepared to throw its soldiers forward, and the sacrifice of so many soldiers, to which we've seen the contrast in the last 24 hours, Ukrainian generals saying, no, we will not put our troops at risk of death here. Just what you sense that does for the next stage of the conflict, because Ukraine, of course, now going into a defensive mode on the front line.
Well, here's the key thing, that despite those artillery shells, despite the mass casualties it's willing to take, Russia has taken a sum total of 2 Ukrainian towns and cities since July 2022. Bakhmut in May 2023, and now Avdiivka, a town which only had 33,000 people before the invasion and which is of limited military significance. So Russia gets a symbolic victory when, in fact, Ukraine has actually won this war in bigger respects. Remember, this country, with international support, has been able to hold on to its capital and 80% of its territory. Its government has not fallen. Indeed, beyond the battlefield and the front lines, Ukraine is actually taking the fight to Russia. It has knocked out a good portion of Russia's Black Sea fleet, breaking the Russian blockade of that vital waterway. It is now striking oil refineries and other positions inside Russia. It is now hitting air bases, knocking out jet fighters and knocking them out in the air. The way that Vladimir Putin tries to ensure that he wins the war is not by winning on the battlefield. It's not by winning the food war, the energy war. It's now the information war. Can he spread enough propaganda and enough disinformation and get enough support from people like the Trumpists that he tells the international community, this isn't worth it, you need to walk away from Kyiv. And then he'll have a free shot at finally conquering the country.
Scott, you and I have spoken over the past few months, of the ebb and flow and the up and downs of Volodymyr Zelensky's reputation, I suppose. We've seen him giving speeches over the course of the past 2 years, 2 years exactly, in fact, next weekend, since the full-scale offensive began, where he was given standing ovations. Now we're at a stage where people listen to him. I just wonder what your thought is of his reputation, how he is seen amongst international leaders.
Well, again, let's put this in context. When you have a long and protracted conflict, leaders will not necessarily be hailed as heroes the entire time. If you think back to World War II, Winston Churchill was criticized by a good deal of the British population. Charles de Gaulle was criticized by a lot of the French population. Well, we know how that ended. And the point here is that yes, there has been tension between Vladimir Zelensky and his military, which has led to the dismissal of General Zaluzhny as commander-in-chief and his replacement. It has been the case that Vladimir Zelensky, who's very tough, very firm, at times has disagreed with other world leaders on the next steps in this campaign. But overall, Zelensky still enjoys support from the vast majority of the Ukrainian people. He enjoys the support from the vast majority of the international community. And the Kremlin knows this, which is why only today we've had more than 100 Kremlin documents which have been leaked and revealed in the Washington Post, which said that the Kremlin has been waging a disinformation campaign to discredit Zelensky. Somehow they have to tear this man down. Because remember, on day one of this conflict, he's the man who said, when it looked like Kyiv would be overrun, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition.